Constantine Venezuela is talking to us from Athens. Thank you, Constantine. A recent report in Canada shows Indigenous children are living in deplorable conditions. The poverty rate for First Nations people is more than 3 times the national average. Joshua Blakeney is our correspondent over in Calgary who joins us. Joshua Blakeney, if I'm a part of a human rights organization and I'm looking at this report, I would be very proactive in making this heard, printed, and extending the alarm on this. Why is that not happening?
I think there's a disconnect between the Harper government and Indigenous peoples in this country because the Harper administration is ideologically opposed to any collective rights, and so I think there is a failure on the part of the Harper government to acknowledge that Indigenous peoples have rights and are deserving their fair share of Canada's inherent wealth, Canada's abundant wealth. And so the dispossession of Indigenous peoples is clearly what's engendering this poverty. This latest study indicates that half of Aboriginal children are living in poverty. In some provinces of Canada, it's 2/3 of Aboriginal children. Indigenous children in this country are 2.5 times more likely to be in poverty than non-Indigenous children. So there's endemic problems in this country, but the Harper administration is doing its very best to eradicate the First Nations collective identity in order to pave the way for the further plundering of the resources that lie under the historic territories of Canada's Indigenous peoples by the very resource companies who many Canadians perceive the Harper government to be in the pocket of. So you have these all-powerful resource companies in this country that have the ear of the Harper government. And I think the Harper government's more interested in placating them than in dealing with the underlying issues which pertain to Canada's wealth and it not reaching the hands of the very Indigenous peoples under whose land it actually exists.
And we know that the First Nation people have actually protested. We had that lady who was on a hunger strike. Is there any way that the government is going to give any concessions to them of what is their God-given right to begin with, but at least to relieve them of some of the hardships that they're going through? Based on this report, you know, that is pretty severe, what they're experiencing there.
Well, I think the problem is the Harper government is a proponent of private property rights. And so the Harper regime and its acolytes in the media have been proposing that the Indigenous peoples be given full private property rights rather than having Aboriginal reserves, which are collectively held. And yet that very prescription for the rest of the world hasn't worked since Reagan and Thatcher giving more privatization, more capitalism has compounded poverty levels rather than alleviated poverty. And so I think that's another problem, that the Harper government thinks sometimes that they're helping the Indigenous peoples by proposing policies like privatization and leaving things to corporations. You know, they often try and say, well, if we just let the corporations go into these reserves, they'll train the Indigenous peoples and help them. So they have this kind of corporate mentality where the best we can do as humanity is leave everything to the CEOs of these big corporations to deal with. And that's not really working for Indigenous people. So other political parties in Canada are proposing more structural solutions and transfer payments. I mean, the transfer payments from the federal government to Aboriginal peoples in this country have been capped at 2% for the last several years. And yet Aboriginal people's populations are mushrooming and ballooning. And so that isn't keeping up with the expansion of populations on Indigenous reserves. So there's many complicated reasons. And the main one is that the Harper government has this extreme neoliberal, neocon ideology, which is not willing to acknowledge the collective rights of Indigenous peoples, of trade unionists, of other groups in this country. They think the only solution is to leave everything to corporations, that they'll save the day. And unfortunately, the statistics and the evidence proves contrary to that assertion of the Harper government.
Very well. It's good to talk to you. Thank you so much, Joshua Blakeney there talking to us from Calgary. Foreign-backed insurgents fighting the Syrian government say that they have received new weapons that they claim could change the course of the battle. The news was broken to the media by a spokesperson for the so-called Free Syrian Army.